Thank you, everyone. If you'd like to find your seats, it is cooler in the front, I would say. So do fill these front seats because we have these doors open here. And the fans, I literally said to myself, don't start today by talking about the heat. It's literally in my notes to myself. Garrard, let this be the first ELCO event that you've been to that doesn't open by mentioning the heat. Like, note to self. And then I've done it. Instead, we could start our conversation with, hey, do you want to know how fossil fuel capitalism is responsible for the destruction of our planet? Because that's how we should start our conversations rather than talking about the heat. Welcome to culture's role in a justice-led fossil fuel phase-out. Does anyone here know how many events there are in London Climate Action Week? How many there have been, because we're near the end? Anyone want to take a guess? Yeah? You're extremely good at this. 1,303. And now, does anyone want to take a guess how many of those events either include in the title or the description fossil fuels, climate justice, or just transition? How many of the 1,303 include those topics? We have a guess here of 2. Any other guesses? 8. 5? 1? Any more? Last guess. We're very pessimistic here. It's 15, which I still thought was very low, but it's the right crowd for it. But only 15 out of 1,303, and this is one of them. So let's make it count. Our world is on fire, while extractive industries built on colonial legacies continue their expansion in the name of profit. The consumption of oil, gas, and coal reached new heights in 2025. And it's urgent for governments to put a stop to more drilling here in the global north, like in the North Sea, and it's ever more urgent to achieve climate justice for global majority peoples. And when we think of the destruction caused by oil, gas, and coal, we may first think of how they're, of course, leading to the obvious, which we know, global warming. But what we need to also remember is that many of these fossil fuel corporations also directly profit from and directly invest in, making them participants in genocide, ecocide, and culturecide. They're also responsible for silencing indigenous land defenders by death. So the military-industrial complex relies on them. And I bring this up because we have to make those connections, those direct connections. And this is why we must take every opportunity that we can to educate ourselves and reveal these connections between our struggles. Because when we, again, talk about the heat here, what does a UK and European heat wave mean? Alongside Palestinians, Lebanese, Sudanese, Congolese, climate migrants from across our global majority, having to endure 100 years of oven-like temperatures in makeshift camps and tents. So what does a UK and Europe heat wave mean alongside that? Thank you for being with us. I'm Garrard. I'm the head of programs at Julie's Bicycle. And many of us are here from JB. JB, or Julie's Bicycle, is an international, not-for-profit, uniting culture, creativity, and climate action to drive change. And it's a real honor to sit here alongside 4 of the most inspiring climate and cultural leaders that I know. I couldn't believe that you said yes when we invited you, genuinely. So it's really a deep honor and a privilege to be sat here with you. I will introduce each of you. Here, first to my left, is Kumi Naidoo. Kumi is a South African human rights and environmental justice activist and president of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. He's the former Secretary General of Amnesty International, and he was the first person from the Global South to lead Greenpeace International. His family started the Ricky Rick Foundation, and through this, he co-founded the Global Artivism Initiative. Next, we have Zamzam Ibrahim, who is a British Somali climate justice activist working across migration, education, and social movements. A former president of the National Union of Students UK, she's currently co-lead of the Alliance for Youth Organising, director of Somalis for Sustainability, a facilitator for Julie's Bicycle, and youth advisor to the UN's Green Jobs Pact. Welcome, Zamzam. Next, we have Chris Garrard, who is the co-founder of Culture Unstained, a campaigns and research organization that has helped turn the tide on fossil fuel sponsorship of museums, galleries, and theatres across the UK. He's also an art activist and has devised and coordinated large-scale creative protests and currently directs an activist choir. Thank you for being with us, Chris. And finally, we have Dominique Palmer, who is a climate justice activist, speaker, author, and slow fashion advocate. She's a coordinator at Climate Live, on the steering committee for the Youth Climate Justice Fund, and an activist for Stop Rosebank. She was involved in organizing the September 2019 climate strikes, which brought 300,000 people on the streets in the UK and inspiring people across the world to take climate action. Dominique's recently written the children's book, Planet Protectors. Our discussion today will center around how global cultural movements can help end the reliance on fossil fuels fast and equitably, how the arts can support this urgent transition, and crucially, how principles of climate justice rooted in liberatory futures must shape that shift. We're at a crosspoint. Alternative policy forums are tackling and advancing the strongest global support for fossil fuel phase-out to date, and we'll hear more about this, where charities are refusing oil money and pouring their energy into land stewardship instead, where artists are harnessing their imaginative power as messengers of equity. And I really, really invite us here today to anchor in our wins and nurture this hope. Let's create an intention for today to have an honest and brave space. We're here to hold it together because we owe each other these truths, and we must make these collective spaces count. So we'll be hearing from each speaker in turn. We'll then open it into a discussion and invite you. So please do think about your questions, your concerns, your remarks. You'll have an opportunity to share as well. Thank you for starting us off, Kumi.
Thank you very much, Garrard. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I was going to say to Garrard, following that kind introduction, she could have introduced me in a slightly different way. She could have said, this guy's been around for almost 45 years fighting for economic justice, gender justice, social justice, and so on, and has very little to show for it. And I only say that off as a joke, because this moment of history that we find ourselves in calls on us to be brutally honest with each other. We must be able to distinguish between winning battles and losing the war for justice. And while we have won some really tough battles for climate justice in the last couple of decades, we must be very clear that actually we are not where we need to be. Then Garrard, when you were saying, you were very surprised that we all said yes to come to Julie's bicycle event.
No, not
I was going to say, well, the reason why I felt obliged to say yes is for two reasons. One is this is the most interestingly named organization. So for those of you who don't know, I'll tell you the secret why it's called Julie's Bicycle. The first founding board meeting held in Islington, Alison came on a bicycle and it was held at a restaurant called Julie's. So that's how the name came on. Did I get it correct, Alison? But there is a second reason, and that is Julie's Bicycle has been a very active part of building this global South-led movement called global activism. So I wanted to bring you into the conversation immediately. So I'm going to do a pop quiz. The first one is, where are we as humanity in terms of addressing the climate crisis that we find ourselves in? I give you three options. Option one, absolutely no reason to panic. Our government and business leaders will get their act together and prevent the worst of climate catastrophe happening, recognizing that we are already in the first phases of catastrophe, particularly in the global south. And okay, in the last couple of days, you all got a little bit of a warning of what's going on here. So option one is no reason to panic. Option two is we have every reason to panic, and the window of opportunity is closing fast, but it is still within human ingenuity, creativity, innovation, and courage that we can broaden that window and move us away from the suicidal trajectory that humanity currently is on. And option three, if you would permit me to use a language from South Africa, which is derived from the Dutch language in Afrikaans, option three is, ons is deep, deep, deep in the kak. Okay, I hope you don't need any translation for that. Okay, so option one, no reason to panic. Option two, every reason to be concerned, but we can turn things around. Option three, it's too late. Anyone for option one? Anyone for option two? Anyone for option three? Okay, so I want to be very honest with you and say that there are days when I wake up, it's option two. There are days when I wake up, it's option 2.5. When Trump was elected, it was 3.5. Okay? But I wanted to start with that as a framing comment. And that is, in the moment of history that we find ourselves in, pessimism is a luxury we simply cannot afford. And the pessimism that justifiably emerges from our analysis, our lived experiences, and our observations can, must, and should be responded to by the optimism of our thought, our action, our creativity, our courage, and our sense of humanity. So what I say to young people when they ask me, but the science is telling a pretty bad picture and it looks like it's too late. And I say, well, even if you have arrived at a conclusion that it's too late, I'm not prepared to let, you can use whatever expletive you want for the next thing, who got us into the situation, the fossil fuel companies, to get away without history holding them accountable. But in my bones and in my reading of the science, even though we are in the early stages of catastrophe now, I believe we can prevent the next two words from happening, which is irreversible, runaway climate change. Now, I want to thank Julie's Bicycle for putting the spotlight on fossil fuels. So let me ask you the next pop quiz. What percentage of the problem, right, is fossil fuels in terms of driving climate change? So is it 50% of the problem, more or less? So I'll give you a clue. It's the biggest cause of climate change, but what is the percentage? Can people just shout out? 70, you can go up. 80, you can go up. Sorry? You've gone a bit too far now. 86%. But think about this, right? We've had 30 years of negotiations at the climate COPs, Conference of the Parties, and only once, 3 years ago, it was mentioned in a very weak way. That's as absurd as Alcoholics Anonymous holding 30 years of conferences without having a backbone to mention alcohol in the outcome document. I mean, that's as absurd as it is. And bear in mind, already in 2009 at the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, I remember Copenhagen was like, this was 2009, a long time ago, right? There There was so much of optimism. The UN named Copenhagen Hopenhagen and all of it. But they end up with people were talking about Floppenhagen, a fuck-up-in-hagen, and so on, right? But what were we asking for in Copenhagen in 2009? We were calling for a fab deal. Not a fabulous deal, but a fair, ambitious, and a binding deal. Binding deal. Because we know our governments, if there's nothing to bind them, before the ink has dried on the paper, by the time they've landed back in the capitals, they've forgotten what they've committed to. But instead of getting a fab deal, what we've got year in, year out, is a flab outcome, F-L-A-B, full of loopholes and bullshit, right? And so we are at a point now where it's becoming irresistible that we have to go to the root cause. Now, I will just have 2 more points. I want to make that quickly. So I want to challenge you for a second, okay? Assuming tomorrow you have a family brunch, and it's for all of us on the panel as well. You have a family brunch tomorrow, right? Family and extended friends brunch, right? How many of you, if your members in your family or your friend circle around the brunch table said to you, I understand you went to some event organized by a strange-sounding organization called Julie's Bicycle. What exactly did they discuss at the meeting? How many of you can say with absolute confidence you would be able to explain what's happening here to your extended family in a way that they will understand what you're talking about? How many of you feel confident that you can communicate this conversation at tomorrow's brunch if family members asked you that you can do that? Okay, there's 4 people here who come from, 6 people who come from very progressive families. The reality is most of us cannot. Why? Because we talk a language that is so jargonistic, so scientific, so policy wonkish, that ordinary people just don't know what we are talking about. So I want to end with one answer to one question that you might get asked. Why is it you've been fighting for so long to come up with a solution on climate and you'll have failed? How would you communicate that in a simple way? So I give you a story that might or might not work in your cultural context. So imagine, so my answer to your family would be, imagine one day you're late for work and you rush off to work in a hurry, and when you get to work, and when you get back home, you open the front door and you see some water coming out of onto the passageway from the bathroom. As you pass the kitchen, you pick up a mop and you proceed to the bathroom to see what's going on. You open the bathroom door and you realize, rushing to work in the morning, I left the stopper on and the tap was dripping and it filled up during the day and it was now coming into the passage. What do you do first? Do you take the mop and you start mopping the floor first, or do you turn off the tap first? Of course we'll turn off the tap. For 30 years we've been mopping up the floor without turning off the tap. The bottom line is we have to turn off the tap and we have to turn it off fast. And I conclude with this point about the mistakes we've made in activism. I think it was an error for us to have framed fossil fuels is a bad thing because it contributes to climate change, full stop. We should have said fossil fuels is really bad for society because it contributes, first and foremost, historically and presently, to war, conflict, and chaos. Secondly, it contributes to health challenges, respiratory illnesses, and so on. Thirdly, it undermines gender equality. Fourthly, it contributes to climate change. Fifthly, it actually undermines democracy when you see how Trump brought the fossil fuel billionaires to Mar-a-Lago, made a deal with them, got millions of money out of them before the elections, and so on. So I conclude by saying there will be people who will tell you that it's too late and so on, but I still believe it's within our capability to turn things around. And the fact that the fossil fuel companies are fighting us so hard can only mean that the person who said this in the beginning of the 20th century, they say Mahatma Gandhi said it first, but he didn't say it first. It was said by a labor organizer in the United States when he said, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. The good news, dear brothers and sisters, they're not ignoring us, they're not laughing at us, they're fighting us, and they're fighting us really hard. And if Gandhi or the actual person who said it were right, let's hope we are one step away from actually winning. Thank you very much.
Sorry, as you were saying, I wanted to, as you were saying that we're mopping up the floor, my thought process was, we're not mopping up the floor. We're looking for the mop. In fact, there are several Zoom meetings, and we're still circling back on who has the mop and who saw it last. And that's honestly the reality in which we're living in. But thank you for that analogy. Honestly, there's so much that you said that made me think, damn, okay, shit, okay. I guess you've been doing this for decades. You've thought of everything I was going to say. I really wanted to talk about, because we were asked to talk about the times that we live in right now. And I thought to myself, like, where do I want to take this? Because there's so many different ways in which we can really take this journey. And actually, first of all, I should say, I have had the pleasure of working with Julie's Bicycle for 4 years. And it's shaped a lot of my political work in the last 4 years, and actually a lot of my thinking. I've worked very closely on something called the Creative Climate Leadership Program, where we do retreats and training for cultural workers, activists, artists, and thinking about how we can be more just and climate justice-led in our work. And it's been a really incredible experience, actually, working with creatives and incredible people, and really challenging them. And for me, I come from the student movement. I was born in the student movement. I have been organizing on campuses since the very beginning. In fact, actually, I started organizing 12 years old because I wanted access to play football and basketball and go swimming as a Muslim woman who didn't have any spaces. And I convinced our local youth center to set up spaces for us, access to women only, and I was able to win that. And I thought, okay, so if you speak up, you can do stuff. Okay, I could do this. And that turned into racial justice organizing, which is really where I did a lot of my work. But I remember, actually, the moment in which I realized the intersection between race and climate. And it was in 2013, there was severe droughts in Somalia. And I remember seeing reports about the communities that are impacted. And I'm seeing this, and I'm telling my mom and dad, they're talking about our region, that's where my family was, right? And I'm hearing, and there were to the point where even donations, money wasn't able to get there, and there was billions and millions that was in aid that was supposed to go to that region, and it didn't. There was, as you mentioned, there was promises made, failed promises. And it was just an understanding, finally, of, for the first time, seeing that, actually, our lives are expendable, right? It was, somebody has the ability to choose who has the ability to go on, who doesn't. And that's when I realized, actually, and there's, I'm raised by 2 African parents, and it's if you want to do something, do it yourself, right? And it was the concept, the idea that, actually, I have to create the world that I want to live in, and I have to fight for that world, and I need to do it by any means necessary. And so that's really what brought me into the climate space. And when I first came into the climate space, I remember thinking, I care about low polar bears. I don't want to talk about turtles. There was the biggest NUS campaign at the time was plastic straws off campuses. That was the most radical campaign on the campus. And so I was actually this, none of this is intersectional. None of this actually talks about our own lived experience and how this climate crisis that so heavily impacts the global south. Everybody's happy to say it heavily impacts the global south, but nothing really embeds that, and nothing really brings that to the forefront. And then also I realized that nobody looks like me. There ain't no kinfolk in this space. And so one of the things that and that's how SOS UK was born, actually. One of the things that I really hold accountable, and I will always have a lot of gratitude to the team of SOS UK at the time, because I came in as a young black organizer who was just angry at the climate space. And they were able to really think about actually how they can do things radically. And it's very uncomfortable, I guess, to be held accountable in that way and to be told that, like, actually your practices are upholding colonial structures. You are implicitly being racist in these spaces by not allowing people of color to come into these spaces. Your campaigns are completely terrible. They're shit. They're not doing the work that they need to be doing. And that's a really uncomfortable thing to hear. From I think I was 21. I was a 21-year-old that came into that organization when I was NUS president. And they didn't take it with, probably in the beginning, they were a little bit like, who's this kid? But they actually took it as a learning curve. We were able to like set up lessons and be able to like really think about how we could change this radically. But anyways, it made me realize that, like, actually there are allies who are willing to do this work with you, right? But actually it takes us to be able to lead that work and show what radical movements look like. And so it kind of brings me to the world that we live in today. Because one of the things that you said is that we don't have the privilege, right, to be able to think about doom and gloom. Like, we are human, we wake up. Today I woke up, and I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm feeling a bit doom and gloom, right? But I've got to persevere, because this work is incredibly important, right? And it's bigger than all of us. And I think one of the things that, like, I'm consistently reminded and have to remind myself is that, like, the world that we want to build and the work that we need to do is bigger than ourselves, right? Zamzam, Ibrahim, I'm completely insignificant to this work. I'm here today, I'm gone tomorrow, but it's my job to push the boulder forward as far as I can. But it's also remembering that, like, I am nobody without my community. I'm nobody without my collective. And there's consistent need to build bridges. And one of the things that I think, as an organizer who's been in the climate space and now working across the climate culture space, one of my most frustrating things with the cultural space is I'm consistent in, like, you need to learn to work in community. You need to be able to understand what it means to build powerful collectives. It means understanding that you don't have all the answers, you never will. We can't build a just and sustainable world that serves all of us if all of us are not around the table, right? You don't know my lived experiences, you never will, you never understand them. I need to be able to feed that to you, you need to be able to understand that. And so actually decentering yourself is the most important thing you can do in this work. And somehow in the cultural space, apparently that's impossible. That's what I've learned. Anyways, that's another TED talk. We'll recap. But, like, it's really difficult, right? Because I get it. Like, in the artist world, it's a very difficult space in the sense of, like, a lot of people are, like, struggling to get by. It's a very bad paid sector. I feel like actually the word, artists are bad paid is, like, slang now. Like, it's so well said, which is really unfortunate. But the reality is that, like, art has never been a commodity, right? The culture in which I come from, art has always sat at the center of everything that we do. The Somali language in itself wasn't a written language until 100 years ago, right? Before that, it was just a spoken language. It was an oral language. We were told stories through song, through music, through poetry. Somalis are known as the land of poets, right? Our entire history is preserved through poetry and through stories, right? That's the culture we live in. And Somali, we were both pastoralists. We moved from one area to another area to another area. We had, like, nomadic land. And now I'm working through Somali Sustainability in Somalia. And 3 years ago, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment was founded in Somalia. It was the first time they had that particular ministry. And, they started attending COPs. And that's when we decided to really start doing a lot of work on the ground. And it was the first time when you, like, and I think there is a real difficult thing, and I think you learn to have a lot of grace for people, you come to a lot of humility with this work. And I think one of the things I try to do consistently is try to understand why this person is trying to do what they can. Because my experience with the ministry has been so difficult, right? It's because they've come into this space, Somalia, a country that's been extracted from, that has colonial history, that is struggled through civil war and all these other problematic issues inflicted on them, right, is trying to, like, submerge out of that. And they come to these COPs essentially trying to see, I've heard there's some fossil fuel deals happening, where can we get some of that money? And that's the energy that these people come with. And honestly, the reality is that, like, it's a country that's been starved of resources for so long, right? That there's a despeраcy. And so I, as a climate activist, who of course is like, absolutely no digging for oil in my land, can't really like, that's not how you communicate. That's not how you, and like you said, you speak to our families, right? And like being able to make somebody understand the harm it's going to cause for our community, for our land, for our waters, for the coast. Somalia has the longest coastline in Africa, the most beautiful coastline in Africa. I mean, of course I'm going to say that, but it really is a factual statement. But like, it's the amount of harm that the pipelines are going to create to just the already like our crops are failing because of droughts, right? The land is unable to sustain the very people that live in it. That even farmers are moving across lands to like Ethiopia and Kenya. So it's really understanding actually like the impact is already so dire, right? People are already dying in devastating numbers, and like now there's an idea that there's a glimpse of hope because Somalia is going to turn into Dubai. Because, you know, there's now oil exploration happening. And so actually one of them is, I think for me, is like really understanding the cycles that we go through and the role that we play in trying to build community and trying to change minds and hearts through the very work that we do in very different formats, right? And it's the ability to be able to like, a lot of us code switch, right? Like we go to work and we speak to our colleagues one way and then we hang out with our friends another way and we speak to our family in another way. That's just code switch. We do that. I know black people do that more than most. But like, here's the thing, right? I think the reality is that like when we're in these spaces, like when we're organizers, when we're like artists, when we're creatives, when we're storytellers, we have to be able to change the story. We have to be able to like, I was talking about the global stocktake and the campaign at COPS actually. And I was like, we need to tell stories better. I think one of the most difficult, I think for me, successful, I might be waffling right now, I know. My brain's going faster than my mouth is able to catch up. But I think one of the most simple and the most impactful campaigns are the ones that are simple enough for a 5-year-old to follow, right? And I think one of the things we do sometimes is we try to like overcomplicate and try to think about like how do we achieve this, trying to think of like X, Y, Z of how we can achieve this end goal. But the reality is that like we need to think about how we can set out to achieve A, then B, then C, then D. And I tell you this, whatever you want to do, whatever work you want to do as an organization doing it already, support them, be a part of that work. And that's what it means to work in a collective. And I think I'm very much sick, and I'm going to kind of end with this. I'm really, really, really tired of seeing, and I think I've spoken to Khalid about this before, I'm sick of seeing new organizations pop up out of nowhere, right? And I'm like, we have 50 of these already. Work together, speak together, like communicate, speak together, ask each other what's happening. And I honestly think, like, if we as a movement of people, I think everybody in this room, more or less, all of you want to fight for climate justice, put your hand up. Yeah? All of you are willing to back me in any beef I get into? Yeah. See? So we're a collective, we're a community, right? And so, like, we need to speak to each other. I need to be able to know what you're doing and what I'm doing so we can work together, right? So we can support each other, so we can build real radical movements, so we can fill in each other's gaps, so we can identify where we're going wrong, sometimes where we need to be rerouted. We need to be able to be open to be held accountable because we're gonna get it wrong, all right? We need to be able to be like, okay, maybe I'm not understanding this. Maybe you need to be able to take lead on this. You know what, I apologize, I made a mistake in this space. And I think, I call it cowardice, but like I think the fear of getting it wrong cripples the movement so badly. And I think that's one of the things that like we need to be able to really step away from, because we are going to get it wrong. We're going to make mistakes. But that's what it takes to build something that's going to be radical, that's going to be sustainable, and that's going to be able to give us the world that we need to be able to live in. Because I am hopeful that we're going to be able to do this work. Because all of you in this room, all of you are here, despite the weather. I'm not going to say heat wave. But yeah, thank you.
I just want to share something with Zamzam and with you when you're reflecting on how difficult it is to be black in the environmental movement. When I got appointed as the head of Greenpeace, Le Monde, the French newspaper, came and did an interview with me. And do you know what they carried the headline? The headline was Black Peace. Oh, God. Right? And then at the same time, in the US, Van Jones was appointed by Obama to be the green job czar, and one newspaper carried a profile of him and me because I had just started at the same time, and they said, and the article was entitled, "Why is it so hard to be black and green at the same time?" Right? So I just wanted to just say that growing up in apartheid South Africa, I also grew up with the thing that environmentalism or environmental justice was what rich people and white people did, right? And now I've realized that that was one of the things that the fossil fuel companies tried to do. They made us feel as if it was our problem because we wanted to drive a car. We said we wanted to drive a car, we never said we wanted it, it had to be fossil fuels. Anyway, thank you.
Hi, I'm Chris. I think, firstly, I'm just like really appreciative of the invitation. I mean, I'm quite nervous because I really look up to the other people in this panel and a lot of people in this room, and I know often you kind of are invited to talk about solutions and positive things, and I feel like I have the wonderful thing of starting with it, of like looking to other people and learning from them is such a, I just have a lot of gratitude. So maybe just to start there. And then I'm trying to think, what are the things to add? Culture. And I think this point, culture does not exist in institutions and organizations. And this is not to say that art and cultural organizations don't do wonderful, incredible things, uplift communities, center voices, innovate, etc., etc. But culture exists. Culture is subversive. It doesn't enable change. Culture is change as well. And I often think back to the Idle No More movement in so-called Canada, when First Nations there took over shopping centres with round dances. That was culture. There wasn't this distinction. And I think particularly in a city like London, particularly in the global north, particularly among communities of white privileged people running a lot of these institutions, there is a notion that they make culture, they own it. They've been put in these spaces where we can sell tickets for it, where we can take human remains and objects and put them in a glass case, put a label on it with a different narrative and a different story on it, and it is owned and controlled. And these institutions, like a short distance that way, will refuse to give it back. That is what appeals to the fossil fuel industry. And it's kind of hard to unpack, and when we talk about like why the inaction of the COPs and why are we still here, is because the fossil fuel industry is baked into the culture of, and maybe a global north, white, Western global north culture, and to the extent that a company like BP or Shell, these I would like to think the villains that we're all in agreement are the villains, are baked into that culture because they were part of a colonial project which displaced people and took their resources, and that is perpetuating today. And this buying and displacing is their modus operandi, and that's what continues, and that's the attitude they hold to culture. So they do not have an interest in the voices or the culture making of communities in the global south or in the communities where they operate. They have an interest in buying into it through sponsorship, through partnership, through insidious connections with government, in order that they can control the story and the narrative. And we need to tell better stories of climate justice, about how we can counter them. They are well-resourced and well-entrenched in these spaces. There are too many examples that come to mind, but maybe a kind of positive example that I like to give is in our campaigning. So I first got into this campaigning because I was into music and I was studying music, and I was over at the South Bank and I was at the Shell Classic International Concert Series. I was like, Shell? Like, what the hell? Like, it didn't make sense. And everyone around me seemed to have no particular issue with it. So it was contributing to this normalization where Shell just kind of seeps into the culture. There are friendly corporations that supply energy and deflect from where it's coming from. And that is what helps to perpetuate the situation we're in. There was a memo that was leaked from BP. Sorry, it wasn't leaked. The US Congress, got to give them some credit, actually managed to get this memo out of BP. And they said, we're going to recruit cultural spaces as our enablers and our defenders in the public realm. And there's this nice little table where they lay it out, so they're not even hiding this. They're like, we can even use this to mitigate the impacts of litigation against us as well. There's a guy called Herb Schmertz. He was the vice president of Mobil Oil, and he said, in his memoir, no less, he was like, you should, fellow oil company execs, involve yourselves in these kind of bespoke cultural projects so that you frame yourself not as narrow-minded, but as culturally entitled, intellectually entitled to have an opinion on these issues by members of government. That is how calculated and cynical it is. So it's really insidious. And then thinking about how organisations like my own and other activists have sought to campaign is that the really important thing is to get comfortable with the discomfort. And there is something in these spaces of programming climate-related events or feeling a comfort in the progressive values that we have in the culture sector. And these are good things. I don't want to disparage programming climate-related work and having those conversations. But when you say, well, what about this bank who happen to be one of the biggest financiers of genocide, are investing in an Israeli weapons company, are investing in that extractive project that this performance is speaking to? What about that? No, we can't talk about that because that would make us uncomfortable. We have to have those conversations. Otherwise, we are not going to kind of disrupt and break that culture. And the positive example I wanted to give is I first got into this by really wanting to do creative activism. I love holding a placard. I like going on a walk with people I love out on the street and chanting. But I like being creative, and hopefully that's shared in this space as well. So I was in this group, and we used to jump up on stage at the Royal Shakespeare Company and do Shakespeare-themed sketches before the play would begin, so people could enjoy the play. And we'd use Shakespeare to try and talk about BP, and this was the starting point of this group. And over time, these little sketches brought actors, frontline communities, many people, really built a movement around it. And the Royal Shakespeare Company eventually got rid of BP as a sponsor. So it's good to get rid of BP as a sponsor. The great thing about BP now having gone as a sponsor is, do people know the play Kyoto that was on recently? Really excellent play. Produced by the Royal Shakespeare Company. And in that, there's a little kind of nice in-joke where he says the interval drinks provided by BP, which is a nod to the fact the theatre was sponsored by BP. And so the reason I highlight that is this question of power. And we don't always like, again, the discomfort around talking about power, who has power, who gets a seat at the table, and also when someone has a seat at the table, are they even allowed to speak or influence decisions? The author Adaf Swaif, Egyptian author, was on the board of the British Museum and found the most useful thing she could do was to resign from the board because her voice wasn't being heard. And she was raising workers' rights, the issue of restitution, and the issue of BP sponsorship there. So we have to go to where the silences are, challenge them and call them out. And I've not really talked about what we do as an organisation. I don't think it matters. But the power of art and culture is to challenge and dig into those spaces and resist being contained and put into boxes that feel safe. And maybe I'll pause there.
Thank you, Claire, as well. Thank you so much. We'd love to hear from you, Dominique.
Wow. How do I follow up with all of that? So much. So many brilliant points, I think, really, to reflect on. Hi, everyone. I'm Dominique. And while we're kind of talking about the heat and feeling it, when it comes to the climate and ecological crisis, we are cooking at the moment, but we are not yet cooked. We are still at a point where there is so much that we can save and that is worth saving. And I think one narrative that I'm seeing now that I think is coming from a lot of grief and anxiety about climate is that humans are just a plague on Earth, or that humans are a virus. And what is really, really important that we get right here in communication is that humans are not a plague on this earth. It is corporate greed, that is. We are not fighting each other. We are not fighting our neighbors. We are not fighting our communities. We are fighting corporate greed and fossil fuel capitalism. Because often, when I first got into the movement, I definitely felt like the narrative around the climate crisis, as has been mentioned so brilliantly on this panel, kind of framed the climate crisis in this separate kind of bubble to lots of different social justice issues, when actually it's so interconnected. And the reason for that is because there are active decisions being made that are putting us further into climate and ecological crisis. And when people kind of see this narrative of, it's just humans, not only does it take away that agency and it makes us feel very passive in what we can actually achieve, but it really shifts the blame. And that is exactly what fossil fuel companies such as BP, such as Shell, such as ExxonMobil have been doing for decades. They are the ones who created the very idea of a carbon footprint. And that was to shift blame from the destruction they were causing, that they knew was due, that they knew was causing the climate crisis, and to shift that onto people. And so now we're in a situation where I think when it comes to narrative, on the flip side of that, we're seeing a lot more understanding of how much things such as fossil fuels are tied to war, is tied to genocide, is tied to what everyday people are facing. I remember when I first got involved in the climate movement, and I first went to the very first COP, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, and they had time to action plastered all over the walls. This was about 7 years ago, and it was my first year in the movement, my first COP. I was so excited. I thought, this is going to be the one. We are going to get this done. I left just a little bit disappointed, as you can imagine. But one of the things I noticed the most was I felt like there was such a lack of discussion about what was the actual root causes. I mean, fossil fuels were the elephant in the room, but also so many of us young people were saying, this affects people in their everyday life. This is about clean air, it's about clean water, it is about indigenous rights to land. It is about gender equality. For example, what I looked at when I first got into the movement, I lived in Lewisham at the time, and it is one of the areas where there's the most toxic levels of air pollution, particularly in black and brown communities, and that's the same across London and across the UK. Especially there's this toxic particle called PM 2.5, and it doesn't really matter. There's a lot of that in the air. And I started thinking, why is it that those who are least responsible for causing climate crisis, especially where I lived personally, where we didn't even own a car, but yet we were being subject to the most air pollution. I also have family in Jamaica, and whenever I go back, I would see the impacts of rising sea levels and beaches washing away, and I thought, why is it that Jamaica, a country which recently has faced so many hurricanes, a country which is facing insane sea level rises and beaches washing away. Why is it that they are on the front lines of the climate crisis? And also looking at environmental justice and people living near toxic landfill sites. And finally, when I was looking at sustainable fashion as well, I thought, okay, why is it that fast fashion companies are able to produce so much? And it's because of cheap labor. And that cheap labor are mostly women in the global south who are producing these garments. And that kind of supply chain, it's gotten to that point because of exploitation and extraction. The same when it comes to animal agriculture, the meat and dairy industry. We know how bad it is for the planet, but why is it that they're able to expand so much in terms of the industry? It's because of land grabbing from indigenous people who are literally, as we speak, putting their bodies on the line to defend their land from illegal logging and from animal agriculture. All that to say that this idea of climate justice, of environmental justice, I feel from 7 years ago when I first started is much more understood now. And I think one of the campaigns I'm part of is called the Stop Rosebank campaign. And we have been campaigning to stop the largest undeveloped oil field off the North Sea. And we took the previous government's decision to approve this oil field to court and did win that court case, which was very exciting. And that's given us a good place in actually stopping it for good. And the thing about Rosebank is what really got the messaging off the ground and really got it to more people was saying this is not going to lower people's energy bills. This is also an issue of everyday people who are struggling to survive while fossil fuel companies are making the biggest profit. And when we start relating this to how people are living their everyday lives as well and to the global injustice that we're seeing, that is when we really start to get to the root causes of the climate crisis, like has been mentioned. But going on to culture, I think culture has a huge point to play in this. And the first time I realized this was back when the Natural History Museum was still sponsored by Shell, was one of the sponsors, and they were having a dinner. And I was me and my climate activist group in London, we decided to go into the museum the day they were having the dinner, hide in the bathrooms, hide wherever we possibly could until it was closing time, and then suddenly just appeared and started blockading where they were going to have this dinner. And that was my first kind of moment understanding how powerful arts and cultural institutions actually are in moving the needle and helping us protect our planetary boundaries. So I'm part of an organization also called Climate Live, and it's a youth-led organization where we harness the power of music to unite people for the climate. And reaching out to an entirely different audience through music isn't a new thing, but it is a powerful thing. Music and culture has always reflected society and vice versa. I mean, my ancestors carried beautiful songs in their hearts in the face of adversity, and protest songs have always been a huge part of history. And when we look at culture now, there's so much that other sectors have to play. This week I have been working on the Adapt to Win campaign, and this is all about. So this was started by 40 elite athletes, and they have been campaigning for climate adaptation and also just raising awareness to the climate crisis. And sometimes what has engaged more people is not jargon, but athletes such as Pops Mensah Bunsu, who's one of the athletes we've been working with, him talking about how when he was in Ghana and he was encouraging kids to play basketball, that's somewhere he considers home, the soles of his shoe literally melted right off. And these are kids that have to play in these conditions every single day. And something like that kind of highlights the issue of the crisis when you connect it to sports and how right now it's too hot for certain athletes to train, etc. I think there's so much room for that. And one last thing that I will say, can you tell that I'm trying to fit a lot into a very short amount of time? One last thing that I will say is the thing that truly gives me hope that despite all we are facing, that we still truly can save so many lives, we can really protect our ecosystems, we can still avert some of the worst impacts of the climate crisis, are the people who are mobilizing. Through the 7 years I've been part of this, and through being part of founding the Youth Climate Justice Fund, I've got to know incredible youth groups. The Afro-Pastoralist Initiative, who are working with sharing indigenous wisdom and moving to sustainable agriculture while also helping the local communities. There are youth groups who are blocking pipelines. They are taking their governments to court. They are doing things on the local level to hold their MPs, their councillors to account. They're doing things on the national level, the international level. And with that momentum, I think is now the time where we need to remember how much power we have. Because if we don't remember that, we are letting them win. And we do not want these corporations who have put us in the situation to win. And we truly have the power to take action right now. And so I think we need to continue what we're doing, but accelerate how we are framing this, accelerate the coalition building that Zamzam was talking about. I truly do have that hope.
I just wanted to share something, because actually when you were talking about air pollution, you remind me of something actually really beautiful that happened to me last week. So I wear many different hats. But one of the things that I do is I do a lot of political education with young boys. And there's an organization called Coffee Afrique. Amazing organization. Honestly, if you've never heard of them, check them out, support them, show them love. They're amazing. But they work with a lot of young boys, young girls. And I was running a workshop for around 20 young boys aged 11 to 15. And it was a creative workshop on climate. And we were doing kind of understanding air pollution, right? Understanding how the climate crisis impacts you here, but also how it impacts our countries back home. So in the room I had Somali, Bengali, Pakistan, Uzbekistan. Like there was a huge mix of young boys in the room, Algeria. And so I read out a bunch of statements to them, right? I was like, okay, so in which country do you think you're going to be most impacted by this levels of air pollution? Your home country, both, or London? And you can imagine these statements, at every single one they stood in their home country. And actually a lot of these statements apply to London, apply to the areas in which they grew up in. They're from East London. And for me, it was like, they were just like, nah, miss, that don't make sense, miss. Like, that's not adding up. Like, London's clean, innit? Like, we have the green spaces and that, like, but like, obviously, like, back home in Algeria, it's crazy hot. And all of them had these really heartbreaking stories about how their families had been impacted. These are kids, these are young people, right? And all of them had these like really insane stories about how, their family had lost all their cattle and therefore couldn't feed, and they had to ration, and then the rest of the community stepped in, and then it meant that the whole village had to ration food for a long time until they could make up the money. Or another one was telling me how he hates going back home because like they don't have water in it. Like there's one like jug of water that gets filled up, and like they have to use that throughout the week, and you have to ration it. And it was like these little stories that they were telling me. They didn't realize the impact that they carry, the stories that they carry. And so for me, it was like a really beautiful moment, because what we did was, at the end of that, is that like I gave them case studies and they did like plays to solve the problem. And every single one turned into like an activist. They all started like, we're going to protest in it. Like, so there was like one case study was essentially like, you live in a busy area. There's horrible air pollution right on the road. But then your landlord is being terrible. He won't give you any retrofitting, and you have to keep the window open, right? But also, if you keep the window open, air pollution is going to come in. It's going to impact you, and you already have somebody with issues breathing. And I've obviously taught them the case of Ella Kissa Deborah. Anyways, they were just like, we're going to go to court, and if you don't take it, we're going to take action. We're going to mobilize. And I didn't even do a workshop on organizing things, right? Every single like campaign, every solution for them turned into like, we're going to go to the streets. And there was something for me in that moment, just watching these young boys, right? Like, first of all, young boys like take on like a really creative, do some acting, like was fun. But then also for them to all just become activists and be like, yeah, we're burning the streets down. What do you mean? What do you mean? Like, we're not taking this. I just sat there and I thought, we're gonna be all right, you know. You know what? If these lot are running the world, like, I'm gonna be okay. And there was just a moment of actually how like artistic practice and performance can really like unpack and really open up conversations that are uncomfortable and difficult to have in ways that aren't traumatic. And I think that was just a great example. Like, you just kind of like reminded me that was so beautiful. And I was just like, yeah, I'm gonna be all right. I can tap out soon. I'm joking.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask the speakers a few questions. Ahead of that, I'd like to just plan our time. Can you give me a show of hands if you have a question for our wonderful speakers? Excellent. So far we've got about 5 questions. We have plenty of time. We have an hour, so we're good. And then I just want to make sure we can prep people to help with passing the mics around. When ready, excellent. Okay, good. We're good. Dominique, I'll start with a question for you around, when we think of environmental justice, a lot of the focus is on ensuring that enough exposure goes to the issues, that people know what the issues are and what has caused those issues. And I've been feeling more and more closely towards the idea that actually environmental justice is the repair, that we need to move the focus much more on the repair. So I'd really, really love to hear from you what you think the global north owes the global majority in reparations, how that can be achieved, what do reparations look like, particularly, Dominique, with your work with the Youth Climate Justice Fund. What is coming out from young voices? I know that I know brilliant cultural groups, grassroots groups, and artists individually that have received funding from the Youth Climate Justice Fund and are doing this brilliant work that is imagining these futures, these liberatory futures that we so deserve. So I would be so grateful if you could talk to us about this.
I really love that, the idea of climate justice being about repair as well. Ooh. I think... Sorry, my brain went completely blank for a second.
Let it be blank. We're here, we have time.
Yeah.
We're with you.
At the Youth Climate Justice Fund, one thing that I have observed is actually just how many young people already have this energy to repair and already have so many ideas about what that could look like where they live and how they can do that. They've just not had the resources. And just a quick show of hands, if anyone has an idea, how much do you think that youth-led climate groups get funded from climate philanthropy? Max, you're not allowed to answer, because I know you know the answer. Anyone? Anyone think it's 1%? 2%? 3%? 4%? 8%? 4. Less than 1. That was correct. When we first started this in 2023, it was 0.76%. It has now gone up to 0.9%, which is still incredibly low. And everyone here, I assume, has heard of the youth climate strikes. And that, as someone who was part of that had so little funding. And yet, it managed to reach people across the world. So some of the examples that we've seen, for example, I talked about the Afro-Pastoralist group, initiative earlier. And this is an example of how indigenous youth are really unlocking climate resilience and solutions themselves. So the Borana pastoralist communities in southern Ethiopia have been grappling with climate-induced droughts for a long time now. And instead of looking at just like, oh, how do we solve like sustainable agriculture to make sure that crops are climate resilient, it's also looking at how do we share this wisdom and this knowledge onto the next generation. And one thing that they have done is actually train 500 young people on climate resistance and sustainable agriculture. And across from like rural and urban communities, young people are thinking of these ideas of repairs. It starts from like community gardening and actually growing their own food, to installing solar panels in their community, to looking at climate smart agriculture. Like there's an endless amount of examples of these solutions that I could give. And I think there's kind of two different focuses that a lot of these young people have. The first one is, well, the government are not giving us these resources and they are not implementing this action that needs to happen, so we're going to do it ourselves. And that's been something that's so powerful, but also in actually trying to galvanize people in holding these leaders accountable also, and that being, those are like the two things that I think young people have really been great at harnessing their energy towards. And it's hard to give examples. I've actually got some written down here. There are actually so many, and I think that's also a very, very hopeful thing. And I do believe that we need to share more of these movement stories that show the power of collective action in what's happening on the ground.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
I did sense an applause was coming. I felt it. Much deserved. Chris, you tell us that culture doesn't enable change. Culture is the change. And I want to take us to like the material financial infrastructures that you work with day in and day out as Culture Unstained, where you may have organizations turn to you and say, but without BP, we simply will not survive. What is your answer to them? I'm sure you have many, I know. I've read and they're valuable. Thank you also that you share so many resources with all of us, the entire community. So when they say this to you, one, what is now, today, your first gut response? And then also, what are the alternatives that are emerging or that we need to return to that will support our cultural sector, that can support cultural institutions ethically?
I will I'll try and answer as coherently as I can. So maybe the first piece, and I don't want to sound at all glib, is there is something about the language that is used in relation to funding of culture. And I think you were intentionally taking it, how will we survive? And when I encounter that, it's really difficult because it's that thing, I need to find a way to open up a conversation. But if we're talking about survival, maybe we need to think differently, because actually, if I'm talking to you about BP and what they are doing with gas flaring in Iraq and the impacts of people there, if we are talking about the ongoing impacts of the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, that is survival. And When you form a kind of funding partnership or a cultural, this is where I go nerdy, so I apologise.
Please go nerdy.
Nerdy. Due diligence. We have this is really sort of like if anyone in our organisation says due diligence report, you sort of get like, it's like bingo. But due diligence report, you're meant to do one, which is like you look at the company you intend to work with and you assess, is this the kind of organisation we want to be affiliated with? So these things are often known about, and what will come back is, and was said to me by someone quite senior in the museum sector, well, that decision didn't really, it wasn't of concern to their community. And I thought about that, and I thought, where does that community end? Because in their mind, it was the immediate locality. And I thought, which communities feel welcome in your museum to begin with? What objects are in your collection that connect you to communities of origin that have come from? Have you consulted them? And this is what came up back in 2015. The British Museum hosted an exhibition called Indigenous Australia, Enduring Civilization, sponsored by BP. It was called the BP exhibition. And so, I love a freedom of information request. That's my other bit of nerdiness. So I thought, FOI the most. Did you actually ask the First Nations whose objects you put on display? And they said, our consultation with Indigenous communities had concluded by then. So no, we didn't inform them. And it was revealing of this underlying attitude. I've drifted from the question. To come back to the question, which is what, maybe there was a question about funding, and there is a question about funding where we need to be more imaginative in terms of solutions. But when we look at somewhere like the British Museum or the Science Museum now, which is partnered with the world's biggest private producer of coal, Adani, it's also a company that partners with the Israeli weapons company Elbit Systems. Like, it's wild. Like, it's totally unacceptable. And I've lost my thread. That it's not about money. That is not about money. That is about the elitism and the power of the people at the top of that institution. And it's really important to make a distinction between curators and front of house staff who want their institutions, museums and cultural spaces to change, and those who have this grip on power. And this guy, Ian Blatchford, the director of the Science Museum, sees himself as an ally of Adani, has had their investors come in for a cocktail reception in the museum, is seeking other opportunities, have described their sponsorship of their new climate gallery, their new energy gallery, as a global profiling opportunity for Adani. They took out a front page advert in India to highlight they were sponsoring this gallery. That is not about the money. That money could be found somewhere else. The Science Museum Group is one of the largest groups of state-funded museums in the UK. Sorry, I went somewhere. On the solutions question, we are still subsidizing the fossil fuel industry to a huge degree. There are millions still, and it will be cleverly hidden away in incentives. And, if you dismantle your own oil rig, so if you clear up your mess, we'll pay you to clear up your own mess. If we address some of that, there is money for culture, there is money for welfare, there is money for many things. The amount that we spent in this is because of the data, not because it's the way I'd want to frame it, of art spending in England has for a long time been roughly equivalent to the art spending for the city of Berlin alone. So that disparity is very clear in that sense. And as you pointed out to me earlier, we currently have this question of should we be cutting further cultural spending in order to put more money into defence, into arms, into weapons. So for me, the solution to that question is structural and systemic. And in a similar way, we could crowdfund. There are these wonderful ways of funding where people have a sense of democratic connection to their organisation or some sense of ownership, and that's a wonderful thing. And yet, sometimes I'm like, is that also a deflection from us naming the systemic problem? And this bizarre thing, sorry, I'll stop now, that you had a company like BP getting all these subsidies from the Chancellor. They're picking all of that up and then taking a little proportion of that to sponsor cultural institutions and say, look how generous we are. We're the generous philanthropists. It is wild. And it's a way of perpetuating this lie to us. Sorry, I went on too long.
Zamzam, you brought us to the ego that can unfortunately be overinflated in artistic spheres, and you juxtaposed it with the humility that we so need. You and I have the privilege of working with Zamzam and spending time with her, and we talk a lot about how actually climate justice is simply racial justice. Of course, it's also gender justice, it's also disability justice. Here, with our common focus with a particular program called Creative Climate Leadership, which is a Julie's Bicycle program, I want to ask you, Zamzam, what do you think that perhaps tell us a little bit about briefly about the program. You said who it's with. You said it's with cultural practitioners and artists and activists, and that it's a residential. Tell us a bit about the objectives, and swiftly, if you could, into the transformation that you've witnessed, and whether that can be the antidote to the ego and to the harm that so many of us experience. And Kumi, you've also mentioned, and you have also mentioned, Dominique, and I felt your energy with us, Chris, to the deep racial harm that we experience, unfortunately also in our sector, in our cultural sector, how this program, what you've seen, the transformations you've seen, serve as that antidote. And if you could give us an example.
Time's up. I'm kidding. Okay, let me. I mean, firstly, I love the Creative Climate Leadership Program. That's my lip gloss. For context, actually, I came into Julie's Bicycle at a time where I spent 10 years in the student movement. I went from like my campus at Salford, National Uni students in the UK, Vice President European students in Brussels, and like all I knew was organizing, and I was tired. I was exhausted. So I came into JB at a time where I wanted to do something different. And boy, did I not have a clue what I was stepping into. Not at all. Honestly, it was such a beautiful thing. In fact, actually, the story of how I got hired for JB was really cute, because I applied for a role, and then Alison contacted me, and also Tiago, who many of you probably know, who's another incredible, beautiful soul. And they were like, we love both of you. We want you both. And we want you to do the role together. And I think that was one of the most brilliant thing. I mean, amongst many million things that Alison comes up with, but that was the most brilliant ideas that Alison ever had, because coming into this role with Tiago was, I think, one of the most nourishing things for me. We taught each other so much and gave each other so much grace. But also, I think one of the things I'm grateful for is I came into this role as an organizer, as an activist, right? And it was very much a cultural creative program, and I was like, so can I do this? Can I do this? And I got given the rein to do anything, which is sometimes a risky thing to do. And I got the opportunity to really rethink the program from my lens. For me as a facilitator, I thought to myself, if we are going to be stepping back, right? If we're going to spend 5 days away from our lives, right? To imagine the world that we want to build, right? First of all, what difficult conversations do we need to have? how do we need to unpack all of this knowledge systems that we've all like inherited and brought into this space? How do we also acknowledge that everyone has different learnings, right? And have come with different knowledge systems, and like, how do we bring everybody into the same space? And then how do we imagine, right? How do we challenge each other in a comfortable and trustful way, right? To go out of this space feeling nourished, but also feeling like I've got work to do, right? And maybe the work that I thought I was doing, right, which was serving the world, isn't actually serving the world. And that's a really uncomfortable conversation to have. And to me, that's what the Creative Climate Leadership Program is. It's an opportunity for, I think, honestly, incredible creatives, talented creatives, to come together and to really ask themselves, like, is what I am doing useful? And actually, what do I need to do to center justice in my work? And for me, I center everything that I talk about. When I talk about climate justice, I talk about it from the root of understanding that, like, all forms of injustice are linked, right? And so my liberation is bound in yours, right? And we need to be able to understand that, but not only understand that, know what it takes, know the sacrifice and the uncomfortability it takes to actually implement that in your role, right? And one of the things I think, I'll tell you a funny story. The first ever CCL that I ran, so we do a couple of programs. If you're going to be on it, I'm not going to actually give it away. But what we did was, within that, we spoke about actually like the role it takes to build something that's bigger than yourself and that outlasts you, right? Like, we spoke about movements, we spoke about the Me Too movement, the BLM movement, and all these like different ways in which arts and culture has fed into it. But like, there was this consistent return back to individuality, right? This capitalistic note that all of us are like very much ingrained in us, of like, oh, I created this art piece and therefore it's mine and my name has to be attached to it. And I said, like, for me, it was alien to me because I've never been in a part of a campaign that doesn't have like 7, 8 organizations as a part of it, because we're trying to get as many people as we can on the streets. And it's like, are you in? Are you in? This organization's in, that organization's in. So for me, I couldn't comprehend this thing of like, actually like this IP that needs to be held on to so tightly, but also wants to be radical and change the world, right? And so I remember like really challenging and going back on it, and then kind of being almost really, and I think it was one of the things of like maybe pushing it a little bit too far, right? Because I come from a very different world. And I remember being told very nicely by Vara and Alison, who was co-leading on the program, actually like how this is the art world and that's what's ingrained into like. And so there was a different language that we need to be able to use to have these conversations. Oh, uncomfortable. We still need to have them. I'm still going to hold you accountable. But like, you're not going to tell me that, oh yeah, my campaign was radical and it brought people on, but actually no, it wasn't free. It had to sit on Spotify, and we had to. You know what I mean? Like, you can't. You need to understand like the ramifications of decisions that you're making, right? And so like, there needs to be ways in which we communicate through different worlds, right? And how we bring together those different conversations and stories. So for me, it was really funny because I was like, oh, okay, maybe I've hit a nerve. And me, I'm thinking, like, if I asked you all today to build like a campaign, right? Like, where would you start? What would you do? Like, if I told you, like, think of one campaign, resource is not a problem, right? I can give you all the money in the world, right? Just tell me what you would do today to build a campaign. If the first question isn't, who can I get in the room and sit down with me, then you've already failed. You're not building a campaign. It's, you've set yourself up to fail. And everybody in that room, and I won't say everybody, but most people in the room didn't think that. They thought, like, what can I do that relates to, like, my artwork and that's going to make me become bigger, and it's because of the world that we live in, right? And like, I think one of the things that like it's been mentioned so many times, like corporate greed, right, is like ingrained within us. There has to be, for us to be able to say that we are working to build the world that we want to live in, we have to live that world in ourselves. We have to ask ourselves, right? Everything, every decision that we make, every question that we ask, every affiliation that we make, where we put our money, where we go, is this something that I believe in? Is this something that I want to invest in? Your time, your energy, your mental capacity, all of that in itself is an investment, right? And so one of the things that like we have to consistently do, and I think like that as a part of like this program, it really asks those really uncomfortable questions. is understanding like what's the role that I play in being able to build a radical world, and how do I have these conversations? Sometimes it's something really as simple as like, how do you speak to your family about the climate crisis, right? Because if we can't speak to your own family, right, then you have no chance of building community. Like, who in your local area is, I mean, I have this running joke, right, of anyone that decides to run an election. I'm like, you need to name 5 bossmans in your area, right? What's the uncle in the chicken shop called? You know, what's the, you know what I mean? Like, if you don't know that area, if you don't know that community, then you shouldn't be representing that community. And so there's a real onus on us specifically as the ones that have taken on the responsibility to tell stories, to really enact the culture space, is that like actually you have a lot of power. You hold a lot of power. This space, if you're in it and you work in this space already, you hold a lot of privilege, right? So you don't have the privilege to be able to be like, oh no, like I'm gonna stay in my lane, right? Because you are essentially a part of the problem. And I think that's a really uncomfortable question we have to ask ourselves. Like, if we're occupying this space, if we're gonna occupy it, then do the right damn thing.
Thank you, Zamzam. Kumi, there are 2 initiatives that I really, really want the audience to hear about. One is the Fossil Fuel Treaty, because you also work very closely with artists and cultural practitioners on this. And the other is global artivism. So if perhaps you could tell us about both of their missions and strategies, where you're at now with them, and then we'll open it out to the audience.
Okay, thank you. So with the Fossil Fuel Treaty, for the last 18 months, we've been trying to push for a connected but parallel process to the climate negotiations to try to get a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty in place. So we have 18 countries that have endorsed this idea and are ready to start negotiations. They include 3 fossil fuel exporting countries. And the big achievement we had recently is pulling off the first fossil fuel just transition conference, where we got 57 countries to come to Colombia at the end of April. There's now a fossil fuel phase-out plan, which we are shopping around here in London Climate Week, in Bonn, and later this year in Turkey. But we're not putting our eggs in the COP basket. We would be extremely foolish to do that, given what Einstein once said when he said the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting to get different results, right? So we will have the second fossil fuel phase-out conference in the first quarter of next year in the Pacific, convened by Tuvalu and the Republic of Ireland this time. The first one was with the Netherlands and Colombia. And we hope to go from 57 countries to closer to 100 countries. And the theory of change we're following is similar to the Landmines Treaty, where you negotiate the entire treaty outside of the UN system, as the Landmines folks did, and then you bring it to the UN General Assembly. And if you can pardon my French, when you bring it, like when the Landmines folks brought it there, they basically say, okay, you fuckers, vote for, say you want landmines. Put up your hand and say, I love landmines, I want landmines. Of course, it carried with the most ambitious countries. And we don't want the UK, US, Saudi Arabia, Russia to be involved right now, because they will pull down progress as they pulled down progress and brought harm to the world, historically speaking. We have another 15 countries that are observing the process, and once we hit about 35 countries, those governments will press the button and call the negotiations. And then once it starts, it'll be a case of Field of Dreams by Kevin Costner. Anybody is old enough to remember that movie? The tagline was, if you build it, they will come, right? Then on the artivism work, as I've been very nicely introduced as a boring mainstream activist, being the head of Greenpeace, Amnesty, and all these, and you know, let's be blunt about it, I was headhunted for these positions because both these institutions wanted me to help them address the deep structural racism that exists in these institutions. Just another quick pop quiz. What proportion of the world's population lives in the global south? What proportion? 73? 85, yeah. Close, but not quite there. 85? Go. 85, it's higher than 85. 89, okay, you just got 1 percentage more, 88. By the way, the scientific answer for this question comes from a combined research of ChatGPT, Claude, and what's the other one?
I don't know, because we shouldn't know them, Kumi.
Yeah, all these AI platforms are going to tell you the same thing, but even if you did it on the back of the envelope. So it tells you how pathetically bad philanthropy is, and I call philanthropy really philanthropy, right? When you look at who controls the decision making, it's 12% of the world's population who brought us the worst crimes in history: slavery, fossil fuel industrial complex, military industrial complex, colonialism, and so on, right? So bottom line is, having gone through that process, I resigned after 2 years as Secretary General of Amnesty because I realized I needed to go to the root cause of what we were doing, and I needed to, because I recognized that basically the main problem was, in activism, is a communications deficit. We talk in a way that hardly anybody understands what we're talking about. So I had an epiphany moment in February 22 when our son, who was a very popular rapper in South Africa, sits his mom and I down and he says, guys, I need to tell you all something. This was just after Archbishop Desmond Tutu died, a few days afterwards. He said, you guys are really not good at what you'll do. You all have been fighting for democracy, human rights, gender equity, sustainability since you were teenagers, and when you look at the world, it's all moving in the wrong direction. So why don't you just chill now and spend the time you should have spent with us when you're unsuccessfully running around the world trying to save it? So we said, well, why is it we're failing? And he said, it's very simple. You'll aim all your narratives at the brain, and you'll ignore the heart, the body, and the soul. And he said, look at what Trump does. He bypasses the brain, he goes straight to the heart, and he weaponizes all sorts of identity, hatred, and so on. So we say to him, you want us to lie like Trump does? He said, no, I'm not saying you should lie, but you don't have to be so boring with the facts, right? And he said, you know, when I've been walking past your Zoom calls, and before that Skype calls, I know you're speaking English, but it sounds like you're speaking some bloody dialect that less than 1% of people in the world, you know, understand. So sadly, after his passing, about 6 weeks after that conversation, through suicide, we set up the Ricky Rick Foundation for the promotion of artivism. We bring art, culture, and activism together. And we sparked a global South-led movement with the inaugural conference in South Africa with 89 countries in September 2024. And then we had the second one in Salvador Bahia, Brazil, where Julie's Bicycle was represented well there through Alison and others. And by the way, Alison serves on the global governance structure of the movement, which means there's a strong connection with Julie's Bicycle. And so for this year, I'll just end up with what the plans are. So we have 6 virtual regional convenings, and we'll invite all of you to participate in more than one if you want, depending where some of us, you know, have multiple identities. We might be living in the north, but our hearts might be in the south, and all of that. And then it will culminate with the 3rd convening in November during the climate negotiations, or before the climate negotiations. It'll be completely virtual this time. And then we have declared with our partners, and we'll do a big public push in the next couple of weeks, to declare November Global Artivism Month, where we're asking cultural creatives in different parts of the world to use that month to showcase the power of the arts and culture to move the needle on not just climate, but on a range of struggles that we are fighting. The main thing also is to be an advocate for the interests of artists. Right now, you'll be surprised or not surprised to know that if you ask yourself, how many people from all the brand name NGOs we know, Greenpeace, Amnesty, Save the Children, Oxfam, and so on, are in prison for their activism versus the number of artists who are in prison for their activism, guess who is the higher number? its artists right now are at severe risk. And that tells you, and I'll end with this, why is it that we need artists? Not simply to educate people, which is a critically important thing because people don't understand. I would argue that the biggest missing link in our climate activism right now is an absence of a sense of imagination. Because people cannot imagine a life without fossil fuels. People cannot imagine a life with lower consumption. Because let's be blunt about it. The worst disease the global north gave us is a disease, not COVID and all of that. It's a disease you can call affluenza. Affluenza is a pathological illness where we've been led to believe that a good, meaningful life comes from more and more and more material consumption, right? And this word development, this word was kicked out as far as away as possible because development assumed that those sitting in the 12% in the global north had arrived and that what they needed to do was help develop us. No, the global north is morally and spiritually deeply, deeply underdeveloped, right? And unless the global north can understand that and understand it was their systems that broke us to this point. And I'll end by saying that one of the things global activism is trying, it's not easy to do, is to make sure that this movement looks like what the world looks like. Because not a single global network that we have, not a single global philanthropy, not a single international NGO comes anywhere close to being 88% led by the global south. And I'm not saying global activism is there either, right? We are moving in that direction, but we have not got there. We probably are at about 60, 65% in terms of staffing, people on the Global Council, and so on. So, and the last thing I would just say is that we have to recognize that people don't want to be involved in things if it's boring, serious, and so on. We have to make activism sexy. We have to make it fun. People will want to leave their homes, not because they want to go to something where everybody's going to be like looking down and this thing. We need to sing, we need to dance, we need to, as I told Greta Thunberg and the Fridays for the Future when we gave them the Amnesty's Ambassador of Conscience Award, we said, it's unfair my generation left your generation with the burden of having to struggle like you're doing now through the student strikes and so on. But please don't let the fascists of our time rob you of your childhood. We have to make sure that we recognize that young people today who are educated, who have been informed about climate, are dealing with a massive mental health crisis, right? They're dealing with eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, fascism anxiety, inequality anxiety, and fundamentally anxiety about their futures. And we need to create circles of support in our activism. Do not, I'll end by saying, do not underestimate the importance of us taking care of ourselves as activists. Alison is looking at me at the back and saying, you are the worst poster boy for saying that, admittedly. But please, don't follow the workaholics like myself example. Look around you. I'm sure you'll find people with more fun and so on, and balance your activism, making sure you're taking care of your physical health, make sure you're taking care of your mental health. And activism, I believe, is one of the key resources to help us take care of ourselves, but also push those in power to act much more faster than they're willing to. Thank you.
I love that so much because a quote that I live by in my activism, as many of you would have heard this quote, is if I can't dance, then I don't want to be part of your revolution. And I very much hold that to heart. If I cannot dance, if I cannot be authentic, if I cannot express myself, if we cannot embrace joy and acknowledge that joy is sustainable, and that's part of our resilience. And I refuse to let corporate greed and the crisis that we face strip away my joy.
And that is part of our cultural resistance. That's how we preserve it, that's how we pass it on to future generations. Questions from you all. Please remind me of your hands. Wonderful. So we have One at the very back in the striped. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Just to say, if you could be quite brief.
Yes.
In the question, and if you want to direct it at anyone in particular or ask generally.
Hi, my name is Sagar. My interest is systems change. My question is open to anyone on the panel. Reflecting on what everyone said, what I've seen in India and also my friends in Africa in the last 15, 20 years, when I see our land and resources being strip-mined and deforested and all the other stuff that's been spoken about, naturally as an interested person in systems change, I follow the system. And I follow where all these products, where all these minerals going to. And I follow it back to the global north. And I think, what are these minerals going to be turned into? What products? This is something, unfortunately, in the climate change space, we talk very little about. In the global south, you've got women and children being trafficked, sex and labor, to mine these minerals. But when they're turned into a product here, they're turned into, specifically, solar panels, wind turbines, and electric cars. I've spoken to a lot of academics and scientists and professors in the last 10 years. They've told me this is wrong. No one's talking about it. And the indigenous people I've met from Brazil and other parts of the world in the last few weeks have told me, why is our land being desecrated for this Green New Deal? Why are our women and children being raped and slaughtered for this Green New Deal? In conclusion, myself, I'm saying I do not agree with this Green New Deal on condition that the people in these spaces show me as to reason why I should allow the people and the land of my country desecrated so we can virtually signal something over here as green when it isn't. This is the problem we are not talking about. And I refuse this Green New Deal on the basis that you've got people being slaughtered, people being displaced, people being trafficked. And to actually push this Green New Deal when you've got something like 5-year-old children, millions across Africa and the global south, and my friends from Indigenous saying, we refuse this, but no one's listening to us. You've got court cases going on against wind turbine companies. Thacker Pass in the US lost it last year. Indigenous people's land has been given over to lithium mine companies so you can have a solar panel. This has to be spoken about. If it isn't, this is the biggest travesty that we are not talking about. Where and when are people going to show me why I should give up my land for this bloody Green New Deal? Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to collect all the questions and then our panel will kindly answer. We had 2 questions here and here. Yeah, great. Thank you. And if you can be as brief as possible and then...
Yeah. My name's Lucy Neal, and it was for Kumi, and he partly answered it actually, so it's less a question, it's more a note. As I was very interested in the Santa Marta outcomes, and you've explained the kind of continuing trajectory. And it's really the same question that I've been looking at, which is culture's role in a justice-led fossil fuel phase-out. So it was more a curious listening out for the trajectory of the treaty in terms of this question and how that question will be carried through. And obviously it's a very different answer depending on the context, politically, economically, geographically, across the globe in terms of how that question gets answered. But it's just to really say that it's great to hold on to that question while so much is being looked at that's so complex. So it's not really a question, it's more just I'll be watching out for that as we go along.
Thank you, Lucy. And then next to you, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah. I'm the founder of a intersectional climate justice charity called Our Green Mosaic. I've been thinking a lot about the patriarchy and patriarchal systems and how they influence culture and how culture influences the patriarchy as well. And in relation to the language that we use around nature, it's in the global north, at least, for the most part, referred to as Mother Nature. And there's an assumption that we can extract fossil fuels endlessly without consequence, without limitation. And I'm just wondering, and this question is open to the whole panel, what your thoughts are on this, and if we thought about gendering nature differently, would our relationship with the natural world change? So if culture shifted the language and it was about either a twinness of genders or gender neutral or father nature, what are your thoughts on this point? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you so much. And here in the front. Here, Richard. Oh, sorry. Was there another question just before this one, and then back there, and great, and then we'll close.
Hi, my name is Chipo. Thank you so much for all of the insights that you've shared. This question might be primarily for Kumi. I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm an artist. I'm now working with a youth-led NGO in Zim, in rural Chimanimani. And I'm just wondering, you touched on it, but I am really wondering about how do we tap into these alternative networks of support? Because, I'm based in London, but having to apply for funding, well, even from Zim, we're applying for funding to Europe, America, to organizations that might not really understand or have different values and priorities. It feels like pushing a boulder up a hill and takes so much energy from the work that we actually want to do. So yeah, I'm just really interested in that, connecting to these alternative networks of support. And also Ricky was an absolute icon and an amazing person.
Thank you, and we are all honoring Ricky. Thank you for sharing, Kumi. Okay, there's one more question and two more. Okay, I've written them down, so I'll remind us, so no worries. Let's take those then. Yeah. And then that's it. Those last two. You can probably tell that I'm very Arab because I refuse the limitations of time. But I also want to say and celebrate us all that we do still have 10 minutes. So
I'll try and take 30 seconds. Hello, my name's Glenn. Like Kumi, I'm a NGO person, campaigner over many years, but I've also have adventures in the art world. I just want to talk about taps and mops. I formed an art collective called Liberatory, and it took 6 years to get BP out, but through art we did manage to do it. But there were times during that period where I thought, am I fucking about with a mop rather than turning on the tap? So my question really is, particularly for you, Kumi, is you've spoken about abstract ideas of imagination, and I agree with you. But what does this look like in practice to really harness art and culture in our struggles, whatever they might be? And to Zamzam, Dominique, or Chris, if any of you want to answer this, I like to win. I'm a campaigner. What are the next wins that we need to see in art and culture? Or beyond that, what are the next campaign wins we need to see in which art and culture can play a really strong role? Thank you.
thank you so much. And just up here, the final question. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, everyone. Really amazing panel. I had a question. I think it's more of a technical question about climate change. And it's to anyone on the panel. As you sit here in 2026 and you look forward, what is the one thing under the climate change umbrella that if someone gave you 100 activists or £100 million, whatever it is, the one thing that you would solve? The one thing that you would solve as you look forward to be the most impactful thing that we can solve underneath the climate change umbrella? That would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we'll go chronologically. The first one, would anyone want to comment on the Green New Deal briefly? Anyone? Yeah.
Just really briefly. I'm sort of conscious when I get the opportunity to speak. I'm like always part of a bigger movement, and I referred to our campaign at the Science Museum, and we work in a coalition with other groups, and so London Mining Network, South Asia Solidarity Group, and many others who hold relationships with Adivasi communities on the ground in India have brought this question of green colonialism into that campaign. And so if you go into the Adani-sponsored gallery at the Science Museum, there's this wonderful, in quotes, image of a huge solar park. And it was through those relationships that there was an understanding that the coal that Adani extracts is part of the problem, but also this displacement of people in order to construct vast solar parks in that form, which is still the kind of capitalist, colonialist kind of attempt at not even a solution, but some kind of response. And the other day, again, just to shout out another amazing group, Parents for Palestine, did a tour for young children through the Science Museum, stopping and talking about herbs from Palestine and talking about the activity of Adani. And someone just problematized this image and said, why not solar panels on a roof that are community owned? Where does the resource come from? And just bringing those questions, and again, just acknowledging the role of young people and youth in that, just how quickly they got it, the different questions they asked and so on. And this thing, which is a blind spot within the movement around green colonialism, they engaged with. And yeah, again, just to acknowledge those groups that bring in those parts that many of us have a blind spot around.
Can I just add to that? So firstly, I think I just would support what Chris said, everything that you said, endorse all of that. Secondly, I think it's very important we don't make a mistake in conversations like this, that because it's not happening in the global north, then we say, oh, nobody is talking about it, right? So basically, I just want to say that's factually inaccurate. That in Africa, for example, let me just speak about Africa, we have been pointing out the human rights violations that comes out of people in Europe and the global north who are feeling very good with themselves about driving electric vehicles, with the terrible exploitation and human rights violations in particularly the DRC. The second thing is the way the question was posed actually ignores the fact that for decades and decades, we've had the desecration of our sacred lands by fossil fuels. So I just had a little bit of a discomfort with the question, right? In the sense that it almost seems that, yes, by the way, we've been fighting for free, prior and informed consent, particularly of indigenous communities, where we have seen a whole range. Some of the details about some of the things happening is not incorrect, right? But to not start by saying that we have had massive desecration of sacred lands, indigenous lands, and so on by fossil fuel companies, we will need to make sure that that's why we don't talk about a transition to a green economy. We talk about a just transition to a green inclusive economy. Let me just say, yeah, in the north, in Europe and all, you'll just talk Green New Deal. Yeah. But for people in the global south who live and work there and breathe there every single day, this is absolutely obvious to us. We've had land grabs that have been going on, including, by the way, by certain big countries in the global south, right, that are exploiting us, in Africa, for example. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to echo that extremely. I think one of the things we need to acknowledge is that language gets co-opted very quickly. But we also need to be very accountable for the way in which we frame things, because to say that nobody's talking about it when we are actively doing this work is an erasure of the work that's happening. And I think we need to acknowledge that, first of all, that I worked with Green New Deal Rising. I actually worked for them and GND Rising, the work that they do is rooted in social justice. They are doing a lot of that work and holding a lot of that work. Their version of a Green New Deal is different to the Green New Deal that you see being implemented in the European Union, right? And so actually we need to be able to understand that within our movements, and we can talk, I'm gonna come into language later on, but language gets co-opted very fast, right? And we do this thing where we fall into absolutes, something is either very good or it's very bad. There's no nuance, right? And we don't find communities and where this work is happening where we can echo the work, because to say that nobody is talking about, and I've heard this too many times, and I get very frustrated personally because it's like, no, people are. There are incredible organising activists that are working with people on the grassroots. But the reason that you're in this room, you're talking about it. We are talking about these conversations, but just because they're not being echoed in the right spaces, then that's a different question. It's how do we echo them in the right space? And I think that's the question we need to be asking, and holding the right people accountable in that work, because our work is rooted in justice.
Thank you so much. I'm going to lovingly challenge us that we answer each question, like one person answers the rest of the questions because of time. But I also want to take a quick moment to say that thank you for these questions. Thank you for your participation. I've actually, ELCO events have been quite quiet, the ones I've been to in terms of the audience's questions. And so it only goes to show that events like this are really important. So please follow, in case I forget later, follow Julie's Bicycle. We will have more open forums like this where we discuss these urgent questions. So on to the second, in terms of the trajectory of the treaty. Did you want to answer Lucy there?
I think I answered it already, right? Yeah. Okay. But what I'll just quickly say, for any one of you who wants to get involved, you can join the campaign in 3 ways. One is you can join as an individual. There's more than 1.3 million folks. So if you are in that network, you'll get updates and things and ideas of how you can contribute. If you live in a city that has not yet endorsed the fossil fuel treaty, please lobby your city council to endorse the treaty. And you live in a country where your government has not endorsed the idea, you can put pressure on your government, because if they don't feel pressure, they're not going to do the right thing.
And we note your note on culture's role specifically. That was what, yes, in the context. So culture's role in a yeah.
Culture's role is central. It's what's been missing. If we don't, and culture is not simply about arts, music, theater, and so on. It's what people live. It's music. It's sport. It's culture. It's food. It's it's just the way we relate to each other, right? And so it has to be brought back in a fundamental way, and adaptation. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. So now on to Hannah's question on patriarchal systems, the language around nature, assumptions of it being endlessly available, and that corporations extract it, and this idea about would it change if nature were gendered differently. Would anyone like to take that question?
Well, thank you for that question. I think it's a really, really interesting question. And I would just say that the principle of ecofeminism, which I'm sure you very much know about, is how nature and, for example, the exploitation of like nature, the natural world, and women being this kind of dual, there's a word for it, it's a dual, anyone? Dual? Yes, essentially that is something that misogynistic part of it is a huge part actually of extraction within the climate space. But I'll just quickly note on language in itself. I think it brings up an interesting perspective about how we talk about nature, specifically as it's something that is very distant to us and not something that we are part of, that we are nature defending itself. And this idea that the environment we're in is as a woods, a forest, a very specific place you go to rather than being like within the environment. And I think one very interesting example is how recently different rivers, for example, have been granted rights, and kind of looking at this concept of animism of rivers and trees, etc., actually being alive, kind of completely reframing the language and how we use it, even how we refer to the natural world. I think that has actually really shifted a lot of perspectives in terms of nature actually being given rights. The idea that nature itself is intrinsically valuable just for existing and not only in the sense of how it can serve us.
Thank you. And the next question around Chipo, you asked about alternative networks of support, and you particularly asked Kumi this question.
So we need like a whole workshop on this, right? But just to note that one of the biggest challenges that cultural creatives and artists, most broadly defined everywhere in the world, are facing is resources. This has been a problem for a long time, not a new problem, right? What the global artivism movement is trying to do is create an ecosystem where all artists, particularly in the global south, can benefit from a more enabling environment. So we're doing a lot of advocacy work with foundations and other resource providers to put more money into the cultural space. We have seen positive evidence of that since we started working in about 2022, 23. I can track a couple of foundations that have increased, but it's gone from 0.5% to you gave that statistic, right?
0.9.
Yes, to 0.9%. It's got a long way to travel. But at the end of the day, I would say we have to be looking at new creative forms of fundraising where we're not dependent on the global north, because the global north have fashions and seasons of what they like to support and so on, and they're quite fickle in terms of staying with commitments, with some exceptions with some foundations, but most of them, like in the US, it's been so disappointing to see how foundations have just run for cover. When Trump came on board, they were like, oh, let's not say anything about diversity and inclusion, let's not say anything about climate, and so on. So we have to figure out new income generating streams, and I do think the technological digital environment that we have today is part of what we need to be looking at more, because if we want guaranteed sustainable organizations, we should not back on funding streams and systems that have never been reliable, permanent, sustainable, and so on. And also, let's be clear, the power dynamic in those relationships, it's deeply problematic, right? I can't tell you how many times I've sat across a young program officer in a foundation in the north who's half my age sometimes, and age shouldn't be a factor, I know, but the way they will engage with you is as if it's their money. It's not like some organization's money. And the kind of, like I always think, if you're talking to me like this, how will you be talking to a young activist that you are, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And then I said, yeah, we thought about all that because we live all of that, right? So I think if you want to get a little bit more, and that's why I say to the African Union is completely politically bankrupt if it continues to not to say we only can function if we get money from the European Union and other governments. So for our own sense of pride on our continent, and we should just remind everybody, Africa is the richest continent on this planet. It is the richest continent underneath the ground, and that's precisely why we're the poorest continent above the ground, because the desecration of our resources and exploitation and the extractive nature with which the North continues to engage with us during colonialism and now is actually the biggest reason why we can't get on our feet. So we have to be looking at how we can stand on our own feet and not have a mentality that, oh, unless some foundation somewhere gives us money, we can't do what we need to do. Thank you.
Next, we had the question around what it looks like in practice to harness the power of culture. You wanted to hear directly some concrete examples. Would anyone like to answer?
One example is that earlier this year, at Climate Live, in collaboration with Earth%, and Brian Eno, we held like an artist ex activist gathering, and we brought together these different artists who had come on board for many different reasons, whether that was to perform at their first festival, whether that was to support the charity, and to actually speak with the youth experts, the activists within the space, and talk to each other on how they can support each other. How can artists feel more supported in speaking out, in joining calls for boycotting of certain festivals, or speaking up about different sponsorships, because the artists actually have a lot of power when they come together in that way, and also how they can help influence culture and mobilize their fan base. And I think that kind of gathering of people and that very human connection that we were able to have was a really powerful way in doing that. And I know that also, I just mentioned Earth Percent, for example, they give 1%. The idea is that artists give kind of 1% of their earnings away to climate and environmental organizations and conservation efforts. And I think those are two very practical examples of, in music at least, how we can actually harness that power. And that's something that different organizations, like such as Julie's Bicycle, who has us here today, have been amazing at doing in the cultural space.
Thank you. And finally, the last question, who would like to take that? Do you remember it was around the one thing, if you could solve just one thing, even though we've been telling you the whole time that all of this is so intersectional. I'm teasing. Of course.
This might sound biased, but basically, if we don't address the root cause, we are kidding ourselves. So if I had $100 million, we would work to get as many people around the world to put pressure on their own governments to transition away from fossil fuels as fast as possible, and to make sure that we have a binding treaty that gives us a chance to hold countries accountable. I think part of that 100 million, I would certainly put it into communications, right, which would be invested in arts and culture, because the theories, the reports and policy papers and all of that we are very good at producing, very few people understand what the hell we're talking about. So I think right now we have to go to the root cause of what's driving the problem. And whatever else we can do, we can get everybody in the world to recycle, right? That would be a good thing. But it only moves the needle tiny bit, right? But if we don't switch off the tap, we're pouring fuel on the fire of the climate change problem, and therefore I think we've delayed it far too long now. We need to go after it in the fastest possible way. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. We're so grateful. Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you so much to all of you, to these incredible speakers. We're so grateful. Really, you've moved us in many ways, more than you can imagine. Truly, hold on to your power and keep sharing it in the way you do. I really want to take a moment to thank Somerset House. Somerset House, thank you so much for hosting us so generously. I'm going to thank you next, Jocelyn. but I do want to thank. She's reminding me of something, and I want to thank her. I want to thank Jocelyn, who has worked so hard on this event, as well as all our colleagues at Julie's Bicycle who are here, to Rachel, to Ruby, to Sarah, to Nancy, to Laura, to Alison for always supporting us, and to the team at Somerset House, and Rachel, and the other Rachel from Somerset House, and Tallulah. And Alison's saying something.
To you, because you
Thank
pulled
you.
this event together.
Thank you so much.